The sleet in Coal Creek did not fall from the heavens. It seemed to rise from the earth itself, a grey, freezing miasma that coated the world in a shroud of ice and coal dust. The steps of the First Church of Redemption were slick with it, a treacherous cascade of black mud and slush that led down to the main thoroughfare where the town's righteous had gathered to watch a soul be flayed. Elspeth Elsie Thorne did not walk down those steps. She was dragged. Her father's hand, usually reserved for holding the Holy Bible, was wrapped tightly in the tangled roots of her hair. Reverend Jeremiah Thorne was a man of iron and scripture, his face a mask of apoplectic fury that turned his skin the color of raw beef. He hauled her out of the sanctuary's heavy oak doors, his boots skidding on the stone, pulling her until her knees struck the unforgiving granite. "Out!" he roared, his voice cracking like a whip over the sound of the wind. "Out of the house of God. Cast out the Jezebel." Elsie scrambled, her fingernails clawing uselessly at his wrist. She was 20 years old, but in that moment she was a child again, terrified of the belt. But she wasn't protecting her back. Her hands flew instinctively to her stomach, the swell of her belly, round and undeniable beneath her torn calico dress. 6 months. A life created in violence, now being sentenced to death by piety. "Father, please," she screamed, the freezing rain mixing with the tears on her face. "It's freezing! You'll kill the babe! There is no babe!" Thorne shrieked, stopping halfway down the stairs to address the crowd that had gathered in the mud below. "There is only sin. She is ruined. She is a vessel of filth." He yanked her hair again, forcing her head back, exposing her throat to the grey sky. "Look at her," Thorne commanded the congregation. "My own flesh corrupted. She opens her legs to demons and expects to eat at the Lord's table." The crowd was a sea of black coats and bonnets, their faces pale and hard. These were miners and their wives, people who scraped a living from the dark earth and feared God more than starvation. They looked at Elsie not with pity, but with the terrifying blank stare of the mob. "Harlot!" a woman shouted from the front row. "Whore of Babylon! Stone her!" a man yelled, his voice thick with coal dust. "Purge the town!" Thorne threw Elsie down. She tumbled the last 3 steps, landing hard in the muck of the street. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She curled into a ball, wrapping her arms around her midsection, sobbing into the freezing sludge. Her dress soaked through instantly, clung to her, outlining the shape of her pregnancy for all to see. Thorne descended the steps like a dark angel of judgment. He stood over her, breathing heavily, steam billowing from his mouth. "You are dead to me," he spat, wiping his hand on his coat as if her hair had dirtied him. "You are dead to this town. Let the winter take you and your bastard." He turned to his deacon, a man named Miller who carried a carriage whip, usually for stray dogs, but today his eyes were fixed on the girl in the mud. "Mark her," Thorne commanded softly, "so that no man will mistake her for clean." Miller stepped forward, uncoiling the leather lash. The sound of the whip cracking against the wet ground was like a gunshot. Elsie squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bite of the leather. She didn't pray to God. She prayed for death to be quick. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. Miller raised his arm. The crowd held its breath, a collective inhalation of anticipated violence. But the whip never fell. A shadow fell over Deacon Miller, a shadow so large, so dense, that it seemed to blot out the weak winter sun. There was a sound, not a shout, not a prayer, but the heavy rhythmic clop-squelch of a massive beast moving through deep mud. The crowd parted. They didn't just step aside, they scrambled, pressing themselves against the wooden storefronts, their eyes widening in sudden, primal fear. A horse stood there, a Belgian draft horse, black as a coal seam and 17 hands high. Its breath plumed in the air like smoke from a furnace, and on its back sat the hangman, Silas Vance. He was a legend whispered about in the dark corners of the saloons, a ghost story told to frightened children. He lived in the Devil's Throat, the high canyon where the sun barely touched. He was a mountain man, a trapper, a bounty hunter who brought men back draped over their saddles more often than upright. He was terrifying. He wore a coat made of stitched wolf pelts, the fur bristling in the wind. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a battered felt hat, but the lower half was visible a thick beard, matted with ice, and a jaw set like a bear trap. He sat motionless, watching the scene. He looked at the reverend on the steps. He looked at the deacon with the raised whip. He looked at the girl curling in the mud. "You interrupt the Lord's work, stranger," Reverend Thorne shouted, though his voice wavered slightly. "Begone! This is a cleansing!" Silas didn't speak. He slowly swung his leg over the saddle. He hit the ground with a sound like a falling tree. Thud. He was taller than any man in the crowd, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle honed by hauling elk carcasses up vertical cliffs. He walked toward the church steps. He didn't hurry. He moved with the inevitable, crushing momentum of a glacier. Deacon Miller turned, the whip still in his hand. "Stay back," Miller warned, his voice rising in panic. "This is church business." Silas ignored him. He walked straight past the deacon as if he were a ghost. He stopped in front of Elsie. She was trembling so violently that the mud around her rippled. She didn't look up. She was waiting for the blow. Silas knelt. The knee of his buckskin trousers sank into the filth. He reached out. His hand was massive, the knuckles scarred and white with cold. He wore fingerless wool gloves that exposed his rough skin. He touched her chin. Elsie flinched, a ragged sob tearing from her throat. "Easy," Silas rumbled. His voice was a low grind, like millstones turning. He tilted her face up. He saw the mud splattered across her cheeks. He saw the terror in her eyes that were the color of bruised violets. He saw a single tear cutting a track through the dirt on her cheek, mixing with a drop of blood from where her hairline had torn. Silas extended his thumb. It was calloused, rough as sandpaper, but his touch was shockingly gentle. He wiped the tear away. He wiped the blood away. "Quiet now, girl," he whispered. "The shouting is done. Get away from her." Deacon Miller screamed, emboldened by the reverend's glare. He raised the whip again, aiming for Silas's back. "She is a sinner," Miller swung. The whip hissed through the air. It never connected. Silas didn't even look back. He moved with a speed that belied his size. He rose from his crouch in a blur of motion, spinning on his heel. His right hand flashed to his belt. Twack! The sound was wet. Sickeningly wet. The tomahawk, a heavy iron head with a hickory handle, buried itself in the center of Deacon Miller's chest. It cleaves through the wool of his coat, through the sternum, and into the heart. Miller gasped, his eyes bulging. The whip fell from his hand. He stood there for a second, suspended in time, looking down at the handle protruding from his ribs. Then he collapsed backward into the mud, dead, before he hit the ground. Silence. Absolute, terrified silence descended on Coal Creek. The wind seemed to stop. The sleet seemed to hang in the air. Reverend Thorne stood frozen on the steps, his mouth open, his face draining of all color. The wrath of God had been replaced by the violence of man. Silas didn't look at the body. He turned back to Elsie. She was staring at him, her hands clutching her belly, her eyes wide with shock. She had just watched a man die for raising a hand against her. Silas bent down. He scooped her up. He lifted her as easily as he would lift a pelt, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. He pulled her against his chest, shielding her from the wind with the wolfskin coat. She smelled of rain and fear, but beneath that, something sweet-like crushed lavender. He carried her to the horse. He set her sideways on the saddle, wrapping the heavy leather reins around the pommel to give her something to hold. He turned to the reverend. Silas Vance's eyes were visible now. They were pale blue, cold as the glacier ice in the devil's throat. "She is ruined," Thorne stammered, pointing a shaking finger at his daughter. "You take a ruined thing." Silas walked to the body of the deacon. He put his boot on the man's chest and yanked the tomahawk free with a wet sucking sound. He wiped the blade on the deacon's coat. He looked at Thorne. "She ain't ruined," Silas growled, his voice carrying to the back of the crowd. "She's just been dropped by a man with weak hands." He shoved the tomahawk back into his belt. "She's mine now," Silas said. "I'm taking her up the mountain. You come for her, you bring more men than this." "And you bring your coffins." He grabbed the horse's bridle. He didn't mount. He began to walk, leading the massive beast through the parting crowd. Elsie clung to the saddle, looking back. She saw her father standing on the steps of the church, small and hateful. She saw the body of the deacon steaming in the cold rain, and then she turned her face toward the broad back of the man leading her into the wilderness. The hangman had come to town, but he hadn't brought death to her. He had brought an exit. The exit was a vertical spine of treacherous, shale-covered trail that wound its way up into the jagged maw of the devil's throat. The sleet of the valley hardened into a driving, crystalline snow as they climbed, a relentless white assault that sought to bury them before they could reach the sanctuary of the high peaks. Elsie clung to the pommel of the saddle, her knuckles bloodless and white, her body was a symphony of agony. The bruising from the stone steps throbbed in time with her racing heart, a deep, rhythmic ache that radiated from her knees up to her spine. But it was the heavy, pulling sensation in her lower abdomen that terrified her most. She wrapped her free arm protectively around the swell of her belly, her fingers curling into the soaked, freezing wool of her dress. She prayed silently, not to the vengeful, wrathful God her father preached of, but to whatever quiet spirit lived in the ancient pines, that the child would hold on, that the violence of the day had not shaken the life loose from her womb. Ahead of her, leading the massive Belgian draft horse by a thick leather rein, Silas Vance walked. He was an immovable object against the gale. He didn't stumble. He didn't slip. His heavy iron-shod boots broke the trail, crushing the ice to powder so the horse could find its footing. He wore the cold like a second skin, the wolf pelt coat frosted with rime, his broad shoulders shielding her from the worst of the headwind. He hadn't spoken a single word since they left the blood-stained mud of Coal Creek. He was a murderer. A man who had cleaved a deacon's chest open with the casual, terrifying efficiency of a butcher. Elsie knew she should be screaming, kicking, throwing herself from the saddle to escape him. But as the freezing wind shrieked through the canyon walls, sounding like the wails of the damned, she looked at the broad, silent expanse of his back and felt the strangest, most perverse sensation. She felt safe. For the first time in 6 months, since the night the world had been violently taken from her in the dark behind a livery stable, no one was looking at her with disgust. The mountain didn't care that she was ruined. The snow didn't judge her expanding waistline. And the hangman, it seemed, only killed those who raised a hand to her. Hours bled into a grey, freezing eternity, just as the feeling entirely left Elsie's toes and the world began to blur at the edges of her vision. The trail widened. They stepped onto a broad, flat plateau sheltered by a massive overhang of sheer granite. "Whoa," Silas rumbled, the vibration of his voice startling her. The horse stopped, its sides heaving, steam rising from its coat in thick white clouds. Elsie blinked through the ice encrusting her eyelashes. Built directly into the mouth of a shallow cave was a cabin. It wasn't a home, it was a fortification. The logs were black pine, stripped of bark and thick as barrels, chinked with a mixture of river mud and animal hair. The roof was heavy sod, designed to hold the weight of 10 feet of snow. There were no welcoming windows, only narrow slits fitted with heavy wooden shutters. Silas dropped the reins. He walked to the side of the horse, his boots crunching loudly in the dry, squeaking snow. He didn't ask if she was well. He didn't offer a gentle hand. He reached up, his massive, leather-clad hands spanning her waist, completely encompassing her, and lifted her from the saddle. The sudden shift in gravity sent a spike of pain through Elsie's pelvis. She gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, her knees buckling the moment her boots touched the ground. Silas didn't let her fall. He caught her against his chest, holding her upright. He smelled of horse sweat, raw tobacco, and the metallic, coppery tang of fresh blood that still stained his belt. He looked down at her, his pale blue eyes narrowing as he registered her pain. He didn't say a word. He simply scooped her up into his arms, pushing the heavy oak door open with his shoulder. The transition from the howling vortex of the blizzard to the interior of the cabin was jarring. It was pitch black inside, the air heavy, stale and freezing. It smelled of curing hides, cold ash and gun oil. Silas carried her across the room, his boots thudding against the dirt-packed floor, and deposited her onto a raised wooden platform in the corner. It was a bed, piled nearly 2 feet high with thick, coarse buffalo robes and bear pelts. "Stay," he commanded, his voice gruff, sounding as though he hadn't used it for conversation in years. He turned away, his massive form swallowed by the darkness. Elsie heard the scrape of a lucifer match, the sudden flare of yellow phosphorus, and the hiss of a kerosene lantern. Light loomed, pushing the shadows back into the corners of the cave. Elsie shrank back against the firs, pulling her knees up to protect her belly, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. It was an ossuary of violence. Steel jaw traps of varying, terrifying sizes hung from the ceiling joists like iron teeth waiting to snap. Skulls of wolves and bears lined a high shelf. A heavy table in the center was covered in lead ingots, a bullet mold, and a disassembled sharps rifle. It was a place meant for a beast, not a pregnant woman. Silas moved to the massive stone hearth. He fed kindling into the dead ashes, his movements quick and efficient. Within minutes, a fire was roaring, throwing erratic, dancing light across his scarred face. He stood up, shucked off his heavy wolfskin coat, and threw it over a chair. Beneath it, he wore a stained canvas shirt that stretched tight across his chest. He walked to the larder, returning with a tin cup of water and a dark, shriveled piece of jerky. He held them out to her. "Eat," he said. Elsie took the cup with trembling hands, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough as tree bark. She took a sip of the water. It was freezing, aching against her teeth, but she swallowed it gratefully. She looked at the jerky, her stomach rolling at the thought of the hard, cured meat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying on the church steps. Silas didn't reply. He stepped back from the bed, putting 5 feet of distance between them, as if she were a fire that might burn him. He looked at her wet hair, her ruined dress, the obvious swell of her pregnancy beneath the sodden fabric. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Take the wet things off," he ordered, looking away, staring at the fire. "Wrap in the furs. You'll freeze the marrow in your bones." Where will you sleep?" Elsie asked, her voice small, echoing in the cavernous space. "Floor," Silas grunted. "But it's your bed." "I said the floor," he snapped, the sudden volume making her flinch. He rubbed a hand roughly over his face, catching his mistake, softening his tone to a low growl. "Blood on my hands, go. Ain't fitting to share a bed with a mother. I sleep by the door." He walked to the far corner, grabbing a single moth-eaten blanket, and dropped heavily onto the packed earth near the threshold, his back to her. He was building a wall, a barrier of hostility and distance, terrified of his own monstrous nature in the presence of something as fragile as the life she carried. Elsie waited until his breathing deepened into a heavy rhythmic rumble. Slowly, painfully, she peeled off the freezing, mud-caked dress and the wet shift beneath. She crawled deep into the pile of pelts. They were coarse and smelled heavily of musk, but they were incredibly warm. She curled onto her side, resting a hand on her bare belly. A tiny, distinct flutter pushed against her palm. A kick. Elsie closed her eyes, letting out a breath she felt she had been holding since she was dragged from the church. "We are alive," she thought to the child in the dark. "We are with a monster, but we are alive." When Elsie woke, the cabin was suffocatingly warm, but the fire had burned down to glowing red embers. The storm outside had escalated, the wind shrieking against the heavy timber door like a physical entity trying to break in. She sat up, holding a heavy bear pelt to her chest. The cabin was empty. Silas was gone. Panic flared in her chest. Had he left her? Had the town posse come up the mountain and dragged him away? She scrambled from the bed, the cold air biting at her bare skin. She found a heavy wool flannel shirt draped over the end of the bed. It belonged to Silas, easily coming down to her knees and swallowing her hands in its sleeves. She buttoned it quickly over her swollen belly. She saw him through the narrow window slit. He was in the lean-to attached to the cave mouth, hacking at a frozen log with a heavy splitting maul, his breath puffing in the sub-zero air. Elsie let out a breath of relief. She turned back to the room. It was filthy, it was chaotic. It was the home of a man who believed he was already dead and was simply waiting for his body to catch up. On the table, she saw what he had left for his own breakfast, a chunk of hardtack biscuit and a cup of black freezing coffee. She looked down at her hands. Her father had called her ruined. He had told the town she was useless, broken, a vessel of sin that could only bring rot. Elsie's jaw tightened. The fear that had paralyzed her on the church steps slowly transmuted into a quiet, burning defiance. She was not a harlot. She was not a victim to be cast aside, and she would not be a useless burden to the man who had bought her life with a tomahawk. She moved. Her body screamed in protest, her bruised knees aching with every step, the heavy weight of her child pulling at her lower back. But she ignored the pain. She found a heavy iron kettle. She hauled it outside the door, scooping it full of pristine snow, ignoring the biting wind that whipped her hair across her face, and hauled it back to the hearth. She stoked the fire, coaxing the embers back to a roaring blaze. She rummaged through his chaotic larder. She found a sack of oats that had been gnawed by mice, careful to scoop from the untouched center. She found a jar of dark, crystallizing molasses and a slab of salted pork belly wrapped in oilcloth. She set the water to boil. She sliced the pork thick, rendering the fat in a heavy cast-iron skillet until it sizzled and popped, filling the stale air of the cabin with a rich, savory aroma. She stirred the oats into the boiling water, adding the molasses, her arm moving rhythmically, working through the stiffness in her shoulders. While the porridge thickened, she turned her attention to the room. She found a stiff broom made of bound twigs. She swept the dirt floor, pushing the debris and old pine needles into the fire. She gathered his scattered tools, lining them up neatly on the workbench. She took his torn, blood-stained canvas shirt from the chair, found a bone needle and a spool of heavy thread in a tin box on the mantel, and set them aside. She was panting, sweat beading on her forehead, her hand resting heavily on her lower back to support the ache, when the heavy timber door swung open. Silas stepped inside, carrying an armful of split wood. He kicked the door shut with his boot, turning to dump the wood in the box. He froze. The air in the cabin had changed. The damp, metallic smell of isolation had been replaced by the warm, sweet scent of molasses and rendering pork. The floor was clear. The tools were organized, and standing by the hearth, enveloped in his oversized flannel shirt, her hair falling in a messy, dark halo around her face, was the girl he thought he had broken just by touching. Elsie wiped her forehead with the back of her sleeve. She didn't cower. She didn't look at the floor. She met his cold, pale blue eyes with a steady gaze. "The fire was dying," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "And you can't fight a mountain on hardtack." She grabbed a rag, wrapping it around the handle of the skillet, and scooped a massive portion of the thick, steaming porridge and pork into a tin bowl. She walked to the table, her gait a slow, pregnant waddle, and set it down. "Sit," she told the hangman. Silas stared at her. He looked at the bowl of food, steam curling up into the cold air. He looked at her bruised face, the purple swelling around her jaw where she had struck the stone steps. He saw the way she held her back, the obvious physical pain she was pushing through just to stand upright. He didn't know what to do with this. He was accustomed to weeping, to begging, to the raw, ugly sounds of men pleading for their lives before he ended them. He wasn't accustomed to resilience. He wasn't accustomed to grace in the face of absolute horror. He dropped his gloves onto the bench. He walked slowly to the table, the floorboards groaning under his immense weight. He sat down. He picked up the wooden spoon. He took a bite. It was hot, rich, and tasted like something he hadn't allowed himself to have in a decade. It tasted like a home. Silas chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. The hostility, the thick wall of distance he had built the night before, seemed to crack slightly in the firelight. He looked at the swell of her belly under his shirt, and for the first time, he didn't see a complication. He saw a testament to a woman who refused to be shattered. "You shouldn't be standing," Silas rumbled, his voice low, lacking the sharp edge it had carried before. "I'm not a porcelain doll, Mr. Vance," Elsie replied, moving back to the chair to pick up his torn shirt and the bone needle. "My father called me ruined. I intend to prove him a liar." Silas watched her thread the needle, her scarred, bruised hands moving with practiced dexterity. He took another bite of the hot food, the storm howling uselessly outside the thick timber walls, and realized the devil had not followed them up the mountain. It had stayed in the church. The blizzard did not break. It settled over the devil's throat like a suffocating shroud, burying the cabin under 6 feet of hard-packed drift. For 11 days, the sun was a myth. The only reality was the oppressive, claustrophobic press of the timber walls, the roaring draught of the chimney, and the ever-shrinking pile of split wood. Silas had pushed his luck on the 5th day. The wind had lulled into a deceptive quiet, and he had taken the heavy iron maul outside to break the ice dam forming over the smoke vent. Elsie had watched through the narrow slit window as the ledge gave way. Silas had fallen, tumbling 12 feet down the sheared granite face into a snow-choked ravine, disappearing in the cloud of white powder. When he finally dragged himself back through the heavy oak door an hour later, he was a walking corpse of ice. The freezing meltwater from the ravine had soaked through his buckskins to the skin. His lips were the color of bruised plums, his massive frame shaking so violently that his teeth audibly cracked together. By nightfall, the shivering stopped, replaced by a dry, terrifying heat. The lung fevers set in with the speed of a prairie fire. Elsie listened to the wet, dragging rattle in his chest, a sound like stones grinding at the bottom of a dry well. The hangman, the giant who had waded through a mob of righteous fury without blinking, was reduced to a thrashing, delirious weight on the floor. She did not panic. The tears had been beaten out of her on the church steps. Now there was only the grim, unyielding necessity of survival. Her own body was a battlefield. Her lower back burned with a constant dull ache, and her ankles had swollen to the point where Silas's oversized wool socks dug deep red lines into her skin. The child pressed heavily against her ribs, making her own breath short and shallow. Yet she moved. She dragged the heavy cast-iron kettle to the fire, her joints popping in protest. She boiled snowmelt, steeping the bitter, dark pine needles she found hanging in bundles from the rafters. She tore strips from the only clean linen she had left her, ruined petticoat, and steeped them in the boiling water, wringing them out with hands that were blistered and raw. She knelt beside him on the hard, packed earth. Silas was trapped in a nightmare, his head thrashing side to side. "The door!" he gasped, his voice a hoarse, broken scrape. The hinges gave. "I wasn't there. God, I wasn't there." Elsie laid the steaming cloth across his forehead. His skin was scorching, baking the moisture out of the rag almost instantly. "Hush now," she whispered, her voice a soft, steady rhythm against the howling of the wind outside. She dipped a wooden spoon into the pine tea, trickling it past his cracked lips. "Drink, Silas. The fire is warm. You're inside." He didn't hear her. His massive hand, the hand that had wielded the tomahawk with such brutal efficiency, shot out and clamped around her wrist. His grip was terrifying, bruising the delicate skin, but Elsie didn't pull away. "Martha," he wept, a raw, devastating sound that tore through the cabin. Tears, hot and fast, leaked from his closed, fever-bright eyes. "I found the tracks, 3 horses, headed south. I found them, Martha. I found them, Martha. I found them all." Elsie froze, the damp cloth hovering in her free hand. Martha. The pieces of the hangman's legend, the bloody tapestry of his life, suddenly snapped into stark, horrifying focus. He wasn't a man born to murder. He was a man hollowed out by it. "The cradle was broken," Silas choked out, his chest heaving as his lungs fought for air through the fluid, drowning them. "The baby, the blood on the floorboards. I hung them, Martha." "I hung them from the cottonwoods. But it didn't bring you back. It didn't wash the floor." He let out a low, guttural wail, a sound of such profound, unadulterated agony that it made Elsie's own heart physically ache. He was trapped in the past, forever walking into a ruined home, forever finding his wife and child slaughtered by outlaws while he was away. He became the hangman, not for justice, but for penance. He lived in the freezing dark of the devil's throat because he believed he didn't deserve the light. Elsie leaned down. She didn't flinch from the monster the town feared. She saw only a father who had lost his world. She placed her free hand over his scarred knuckles, gently prying his bruising grip from her wrist, and then wove her fingers through his. She leaned her face close to his ear, her hair brushing against his sweat-drenched beard. "They are at peace," she whispered, pouring every ounce of conviction she possessed into the lie, playing the ghost he needed her to be. "The floor is clean, Silas. The work is done. You can rest." His thrashing slowed. The frantic, rolling motion of his eyes beneath his eyelids ceased. The heavy, suffocating grip of his guilt seemed to loosen just a fraction at the sound of forgiveness, even if it was a phantom's. His breathing leveled out, the ragged edges softening as exhaustion finally dragged him under. Elsie stayed on the floor beside him for 3 days. She kept the fire roaring. She forced broth down his throat. She slept in snatches, curled against his side, using her own body heat, the warmth of her pregnant, heavy frame to draw the chill from his bones when the fever broke and the shivering returned. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died. The silence that followed was absolute, ringing in the ears like a struck bell. Pale, watery sunlight filtered through the cracks in the heavy wooden shutters, painting thin lines of gold across the dusty floor. Silas opened his eyes. The delirium was gone, leaving behind eyes the color of clear, washed slate. He lay perfectly still, staring at the soot-stained rafters overhead, listening to the quiet. He felt the heavy, stifling weight of the buffalo robes covering him, and beneath them, a dull, aching exhaustion in every muscle fiber. He turned his head slowly. Elsie was asleep, sitting upright against the heavy timber leg of the table. Her chin rested on her chest, her breathing slow and even. She was wearing his oversized flannel shirt, the fabric stretched taut over the pronounced, undeniable mound of her stomach. Her face was pale, dark circles bruising the delicate skin beneath her eyes. Her hands lay open in her lap, red, raw and blistered from hauling wood and boiling water. She had not let the fire die. She had not let him die. Silas pushed himself up onto one elbow, his chest burning with a dull, residual fire, a coughing fit threatening at the back of his throat. He swallowed it down. He didn't want to wake her, but the rustle of the heavy furs was loud in the silent cabin. Elsie stirred, her eyes fluttered open, blinking against the weak light. She saw him sitting up. "You're awake," she breathed, her voice raspy. She shifted, wincing as her stiff joints protested, placing a hand on the small of her back to support herself. "You stayed," Silas rasped. His voice was ruined, a gravelly whisper. "The snow is 6 feet deep," Elsie replied, a faint, tired smile touching the corners of her mouth. "I wasn't going far." Silas looked at the clean rags hanging by the fire, the empty tin cup, the meticulously stacked firewood. He looked at the woman his town had called a vessel of filth. "I spoke in the dark," Silas said, his gaze dropping to the floorboards. The shame of his vulnerability was a physical weight. "I saw ghosts." "You saw your wife," Elsie said softly. "She didn't let him hide from it. You saw your child." Silas closed his eyes, his jaw clenching so tight the muscles jumped. "I was on the trap line. 5 days. When I came back, the cabin was burned. They took everything." He opened his eyes, looking at her with a stark, terrifying emptiness. "I killed 12 men tracking them down. I hung the last 3 by the river. But the blood is still there, Elsie. It doesn't wash out." "You think you deserve to live in the dark," she said, leaning forward. "You think if you freeze up here, it makes up for the fire down there." "I am a violent man," Silas whispered. "I ain't fit for anything soft. I touch things and they break." Elsie didn't argue. She stood up. Her movements were slow, encumbered by the weight of her child. She walked across the short distance between them and knelt on the edge of the furs. "Give me your hand," she commanded. Silas hesitated. He looked at his hand, massive, scarred, stained with years of grease and blood. He looked at her. "Give me your hand, Silas." Slowly, his arm trembling with weakness, he extended his right hand. Elsie took it, her small, blistered fingers wrapped around his thick wrist. She guided his hand forward, pulling it toward her own body. Silas tried to pull back, terrified of his own clumsy strength, terrified of hurting her. "Elsie, don't." She didn't listen. She pressed his massive, scarred palm flat against the taut woolen fabric, covering her swollen belly. Silas froze. He stopped breathing entirely. Beneath the rough cloth, beneath the skin, there was a sudden, distinct movement. A firm, rolling push, a kick. It beat against the center of his palm, a tiny, defiant throb of existence. Life. Pure, uncorrupted, undeniable life. Silas's pale eyes went wide. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He stared at his hand resting on her stomach, feeling the child shift again, responding to the warmth of his touch. It had been 10 years since he had felt anything but the recoil of a rifle or the slick grip of a tomahawk handle. 10 years of holding death. "You didn't break me," Elsie whispered, looking down at his hand, then up into his eyes. Her own eyes were shining with unshed tears. "You carried me out of the mud. You didn't touch me with violence. You touched me with grace." She placed her hand over his, pressing it tighter against her child. "This is what's left, Silas," she said fiercely. "Life. The town called me ruined, and you called me yours. So be mine. Be a shield for this instead of a hangman for the dead." Silas let out a breath that sounded like a sob. His hand, shaking uncontrollably now, flexed gently, his thick fingers curling slightly as if to cup the shape of the life blooming beneath them. The thick, impenetrable ice that had encased his heart for a decade cracked, splitting open in the quiet warmth of the cabin, melted by the defiant heartbeat of a child he had not made, but whom he suddenly desperately knew he would die to protect. "Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below." The mountain wept. For 3 long weeks, the solid ice that had entombed the devil's throat turned into a weeping, treacherous slush, the runoff carving deep, black veins into the granite. The silence of the deep winter, which had cocooned Elsie and Silas in a fragile, healing peace, was shattered by the constant rushing roar of meltwater. Inside the cabin, the air had changed. It was no longer the stale, recycled breath of a tomb. It smelled of wood smoke, roasting venison, and the sharp, clean scent of the pine needles Elsie had swept across the floorboards. She was in her 8th month now. Her belly was a taut, heavy drum that shifted her center of gravity, causing her to waddle with a hand pressed perpetually to the small of her aching back. Silas sat at the heavy oak table in the pre-dawn gloom, the only light coming from the dying embers of the hearth. He was running an oiled rag over the breech of his Sharps buffalo rifle. He did not look like the fever-wasted ghost from the blizzard. His massive frame had filled out again, the muscle dense and coiled under his canvas shirt. But the change in his eyes was the most profound. The pale, dead slate had thawed. He watched Elsie as she slept in the bed, his gaze tracking the steady rise and fall of the buffalo robes, a fierce, territorial possessiveness radiating from his entire body. He had become a sentinel. Crack! The sound was faint, barely cutting through the noise of the rushing creek outside. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a dry branch snapping under the weight of a heavy boot. Silas froze. The oiled rag stopped moving. He didn't turn his head. He merely shifted his eyes toward the heavy timber door. The wind shifted, blowing down the canyon. It pushed a scent through the chinks in the logs. Pitch pine and kerosene. Men did not carry torches into the high lonesome unless they intended to burn something to the ground. Silas stood up. He didn't make a sound. He crossed the room in 3 long, silent strides, moving with a terrifying, predatory grace that belied his massive size. He reached the bed. He pressed a large, calloused hand firmly over Elsie's mouth. She woke instantly, her eyes flying open in sheer panic, her hands flying up to claw at his wrist. "Shh," Silas breathed, his face inches from hers in the dark. "It's me. Do not make a sound." He removed his hand. Elsie gasped quietly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the grim, lethal set of his jaw. The hangman had returned to his face. "What is it?" she mouthed, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding her tongue. "Your father," Silas whispered, his voice a low, vibrating grind. "He brought a flock." Elsie's blood ran cold. The memory of the church steps, the mud, the crack of the whip, washed over her in a suffocating wave. She instinctively curled her body around her swollen belly. "Get up!" Silas commanded softly. He threw the furs back. He didn't give her time to panic. He grabbed her heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. He guided her toward the center of the room, near the larder. He dropped to his knees, his fingers finding a recessed iron ring in the floorboards. He heaved upward. A heavy trapdoor lifted, revealing the black, yawning maw of the root cellar. It smelled of damp earth and old potatoes. "Down," Silas ordered. Elsie didn't argue. She lowered herself clumsily down the wooden ladder, her breathing ragged, her pregnant belly scraping against the rough rungs. The cellar was freezing, a cramped earthen box no larger than a grave. Silas leaned over the opening. He reached into his belt and pulled out a long, heavy skinning knife with a handle made of polished elk bone. He pressed it into her trembling hand. "You stay in the dark," Silas told her, his pale eyes burning with a fierce, holy violence. "If this door opens and the face looking down ain't mine, you push this blade up onto that chin and you don't stop pushing until you hit bone. Do you understand me, Elsie?" "Silas, there are too many of them," she choked out, tears brimming in her eyes. "They'll kill you." "I am the devil's throat," Silas rumbled. They just walked into the mouth. He dropped the trapdoor. The thud plunged Elsie into absolute suffocating blackness. She heard the scrape of the heavy table being dragged over the door, hiding it from view. Outside, the pre-dawn gloom was suddenly shattered by the flickering, hellish orange glow of torches. "Vance!" The voice echoed off the canyon walls, magnified by the granite. It was Reverend Jeremiah Thorne. It dripped with fanaticism and righteous fury. "Come out, beast! The Lord's judgment has arrived. We have come to purge the rot from this mountain." Silas stood in the center of the cabin. He didn't bother with his coat. He checked the action of the sharps. He pulled his tomahawk from the block on the mantel and slid it through his belt. He picked up a heavy, twin-barreled coach gun. "Burn it!" Thorne screamed from the yard. "Burn it!" Thorne screamed from the yard. "Burn the den of iniquity! Let the fire cleanse the whore." Silas kicked the heavy oak door open. He didn't wait for them to throw the torches. He stepped out onto the porch, a towering silhouette against the dark interior of the cabin. He raised the coach gun. Boom! The deafening roar of black powder shattered the morning. A blinding flash of muzzle fire illuminated the yard. A zealot, 20 yards away with his arm cocked back to throw a blazing kerosene rag, took the brunt of the buckshot in the chest. He flew backward as if kicked by a mule, the torch tumbling into the slush. "He's at the door!" Someone screamed in the chaos. "Fire!" A volley of rifle fire erupted from the tree line. Bullets hammered the thick black pine logs of the cabin, sending deadly splinters the size of daggers flying across the porch. Silas dropped to one knee, the heavy wood absorbing the lead that would have torn a lesser man in half. He dropped the empty coach gun. He brought the sharps up to his shoulder. He didn't shoot blindly. He waited for a muzzle flash. Crack! The buffalo gun roared. A man in the trees shrieked, a high, wet sound that was instantly silenced. "Flank him!" Reverend Thorne bellowed, his voice cracking. "Do not let the devil breathe!" 4 men broke from the cover of the rocks, charging toward the side of the cabin, their boots churning the muddy snow. Silas smirked, a terrifying, humorless baring of teeth. He had spent the last week setting the perimeter. The first man reached the corner of the cabin. He stepped in a patch of mud that looked identical to the rest of the yard. Clang! A massive forged steel bear trap, buried inches beneath the slush, snapped shut with the force of a guillotine. The iron jaws bit through the man's leather boot, through the man's, and shattered his tibia. The man let out a blood-curdling scream, collapsing into the mud, writhing in pure agony. The 3 men behind him panicked, sliding to a halt in the slush, their eyes darting to the ground in terror. It was the hesitation Silas needed. He didn't reload the rifle. He abandoned the porch. He vaulted over the railing, landing in the mud with a heavy splash, the tomahawk already in his hand. He moved like a phantom. He was among the 3 stalled men before they could raise their rifles. He didn't fight like a gentleman. He fought like an apex predator defending its den. The tomahawk rose and fell in a brutal, wet arc. It buried itself in the collarbone of a closest man, dropping him instantly. Silas used the momentum to spin, ripping the blade free, and drove his massive fist into the throat of the second man. Cartilage crushed under the impact. The man dropped his gun, clutching his neck, suffocating on his own blood. The third man raised his pistol, his hands shaking so violently the barrel rattled. Silas didn't flinch. He grabbed the barrel of the pistol with his bare hand, ignoring the searing heat of the metal, and drove the heavy iron head of the tomahawk into the side of the man's skull. The yard was a slaughterhouse. Blood steamed in the cold morning air, melting the snow where it fell. Silas breathed heavily, his chest heaving, his canvas shirt splattered in crimson. But in his feral rage, he had been drawn away from the cabin. Reverend Jeremiah Thorne had not charged. He had watched his flock be butchered, and while the hangman was distracted in the mud, Thorne slipped through the shadows, moving toward the open door of the cabin. Down in the blackness of the root cellar, Elsie held her breath. The noise above was a terrifying cacophony of gunfire, screams, and the heavy, bone-jarring thuds of bodies hitting the floorboards. She knelt on the damp earth, both hands gripping the bone handle of the skinning knife, the blade pointed upward. Suddenly the shooting stopped. There was only the sound of heavy, frantic boots inside the cabin above her. The table was shoved violently across the floor, the wood shrieking in protest. Elsie's heart stopped. Silas wouldn't move the table like that. The iron ring rattled. The trap door was yanked open. Grey morning light flooded the cellar, blinding her for a fraction of a second. Standing at the top of the ladder, silhouetted against the light, was a man holding a dripping kerosene torch. It was her father. Reverend Thorne peered down into the gloom. He saw her kneeling in the dirt, heavy and swollen, his face twisted into a mask of pure, fanatical revulsion. "There you are," Thorne spat, his voice trembling with a dark, twisted euphoria. "Hiding in the dirt like the serpent you are." "Get away from me," Elsie warned, her voice shaking, holding the knife up into the light. "I have come to save your soul, Elspeth," Thorne preached, ignoring the blade. He reached behind his back and drew a long, rusted hunting knife from his belt. "The beast outside has slaughtered the righteous. But I will not let you bring a demon into this world. The Lord demands a sacrifice to cleanse the stain." He didn't use the ladder. He jumped down into the shallow cellar, landing heavily on the dirt floor, crowding her in the claustrophobic space. He raised the knife, his eyes burning with a madness that no scripture could cure. "Repent," he screamed, lunging forward to bury the blade in her pregnant belly. Elsie didn't close her eyes. She didn't weep. The memory of the mud on the church steps, the shame, the helplessness, it all vanished, burned away by a sudden, consuming inferno of maternal rage. She was not the ruined girl of Coal Creek. She was the mother of the devil's throat. As Thorne lunged, bringing his knife down, Elsie threw her left arm up, taking the vicious slash of his blade across her forearm. The pain was blinding, white-hot, but she didn't scream. She used the momentum of his attack. She stepped forward, ignoring the awkward weight of her belly, and drove the heavy skinning knife upward with every ounce of strength she possessed. The blade sank deep into Reverend Thorne's groin, burying itself to the hilt in his upper thigh, severing the femoral artery. Thorne froze. His eyes bulged wide, the fanaticism suddenly replaced by sheer, unadulterated shock. He looked down at his daughter. Elsie twisted the blade, her face splattered with his blood, her eyes blazing with a feral, terrifying light. "I am not ruined," Elsie screamed, her voice echoing in the dark earth, raw and triumphant. "I am a mother." She ripped the knife free. Thorne let out a gurgling, wet gasp. The torch fell from his hand, sputtering out in the damp dirt. His legs gave out and he collapsed to the floor of the cellar, clutching his leg as the life pumped rapidly out of him into the dark soil. Elsie fell back against the earthen wall, dropping the bloody knife, clutching her bleeding arm, and gasping for air in the darkness, waiting for the hangman to come home. The heavy wet thud of boots hitting the porch shattered the ringing silence of the cabin above. Silas burst through the doorway, his chest heaving, his canvas shirt painted in a horrifying tapestry of fresh crimson. He had cleared the yard, leaving the snow stained and the zealots broken, but the panic in his veins was a potent, icy venom. He had seen the table shoved aside. He had seen the open trap door. "Elsie!" The roar that tore from his throat was not human. It was the sound of a beast discovering its den had been raided. He threw himself to his knees at the edge of the root cellar, his massive hands gripping the rough-hewn floorboards so hard the wood splintered. He peered down into the gloom, the metallic scent of fresh arterial blood hitting his nose like a physical blow. In the dim grey light filtering from above, he saw it. Reverend Jeremiah Thorne lay on his back in the dirt, his eyes wide and glassy, staring unblinkingly at the ceiling. A massive pool of dark, steaming blood had saturated the earthen floor beneath his ruined thigh. He was dead, and huddled against the far wall, her chest rising and falling in shallow, frantic gasps, was Elsie. Her left arm was clamped tightly over a deep bleeding slash on her right forearm. Her face was speckled with her father's blood, her eyes wide, feral, and completely devoid of tears. Silas didn't speak. He didn't ask what happened. The bloody skinning knife resting in the dirt told the entire brutal story. He dropped down into the cramped space, his massive frame making the cellar feel impossibly small. He didn't look at the Reverend. He reached for Elsie, his hands shaking with an adrenaline crash so severe it made his teeth chatter. "I've got you," Silas whispered, his voice cracking, a raw, devastated sound. "I've got you, girl." He scooped her up, mindful of her belly, and hoisted her upward, setting her gently on the cabin floor before pulling himself up after her. The cabin was a wreck, but the fire in the hearth still burned, casting a warm, steady glow against the encroaching dawn. Silas carried her to the bed, laying her back against the buffalo robes. He ignored his own wounds, the shallow cuts, the bruising, the exhaustion that pulled at his bones. He focused entirely on her arm. He fetched a clean basin, cracking the ice over the water bucket with his knuckles, and brought it to the bedside along with a roll of clean, boiled linen. "Hold still," he murmured, his thick, blood-stained fingers moving with a terrifying, paradoxical gentleness. He washed the cut. It was long, starting near her elbow and ending at her wrist, but it hadn't struck the vein. Thorne's madness had made him clumsy. Elsie's survival instinct had made her fast. Elsie hissed as the cold water bit into the raw flesh, but she didn't pull away. She watched Silas. She watched the way his jaw trembled as he bound the wound, the way his pale eyes tracked every flinch she made. He was looking at her as if she were made of spun glass, terrified that the violence of the morning had shattered her irreparably. When the bandage was tied off, Silas sat back on his heels. He looked at her bloody dress, at the gore matting his own hands. He looked toward the open trapdoor, where the man who had sired her lay dead by her own hand. Silas stood up. He walked to the heavy oak table, righting it from where Thorne had shoved it. He moved with a stiff, mechanical gait. He went to the loose stone beneath the hearth, prying it up with the edge of his tomahawk. He pulled out a heavy iron-bound lockbox. He carried it to the table and flipped the latch. Inside lay the accumulation of 10 years of death and isolation. Stacks of gold eagles, silver dollars, and small leather pouches heavy with raw gold dust. It was a fortune. It was blood money, bounty money, trapping money. Silas pulled a heavy canvas sack from the peg on the wall. He began dumping the gold into it. "The pass is clearing," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth that had begun to bloom there over the past few weeks. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. "The snow is melting. I'll saddle the draft horse. He's slow, but he's steady. He won't slip." Elsie sat up, clutching her bandaged arm to her chest. "Silas, what are you doing?" "I'm packing your way out," he grunted, shoving the last of the pouches into the sack and pulling the drawstring tight. "There's enough here to get you to Denver, to San Francisco. You can buy a house, a business. You can hire people to protect you." He walked back to the bed, holding the heavy sack by his side. His face was a mask of gray, agonizing resignation. "This is a slaughterhouse, Elsie," Silas whispered, gesturing broadly to the cabin, the yard outside, the trapdoor. "I told you I was a violent man. I attract it. I breed it. The devil's throat ain't a nursery. It's a graveyard." He looked at her belly, his eyes swimming with a grief so profound it seemed to age him 10 years in a single second. "You had to kill your own flesh and blood today because of me," he choked out, the words tearing at his throat. "Because I brought you here. I can't protect you from the world, Elsie. I am the thing people need protecting from. Take the gold. Go somewhere soft. Somewhere the child won't learn the smell of blood before it learns to walk." Elsie stared at the canvas sack. She looked at the man offering it, a giant who had waded through a dozen armed men to keep her safe, a man who had wiped the tears from her face in the mud of Coal Creek, a man who had wept in his sleep for the family he couldn't save. For the family he couldn't save. He was trying to banish himself. He was trying to be the hangman again because he thought he didn't deserve to be a father. Elsie swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her body ached, her arm burned, and the weight of her pregnancy pulled at her spine. But she stood up. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She reached out and took the heavy canvas sack from his hand. Silas let out a ragged breath, squeezing his eyes shut, preparing for the agony of watching her walk out the door. It is right, he told himself. It is the only way she survives. Elsie didn't walk to the door. She walked to the window slit overlooking the deep, rushing ravine. She lifted the heavy sack with her good arm, resting it on the sill. She pushed. The sack tumbled out the window. There was no grand sound, just a distant, heavy splash as a fortune in gold hit the frothing, icy meltwater of the creek, hundreds of feet below, swallowed instantly by the mountain. Silas's eyes flew open. His jaw dropped. "Elsie, woman, are you mad? That was your freedom." Elsie turned to face him. She didn't look like a ruined girl. She looked like a queen standing in the ruins of a conquered kingdom. "Freedom from what?" she demanded, stepping into his space, forcing him to look down at her. "From you? From the only man who ever looked at me and saw something worth defending." She reached out. She didn't care about the blood drying on his skin. She grabbed his massive, calloused hand, her small fingers wrapping tightly around his thick knuckles. "You think a pile of metal makes me safe?" Elsie asked, her voice trembling with an overwhelming, fierce love. "I lived in a town full of good men, Silas. Men who read scripture and washed their hands, and they dragged me into the street to be stoned. I don't want a soft man. I don't want a saint." She pulled his hand forward, ignoring his weak resistance. She pressed his bloody palm flat against the center of her swollen belly. "This child doesn't need a saint," Elsie whispered, looking deep into his pale, shattered eyes. "It needs a protector. It needs a father who knows how to keep the wolves from the door." Silas stared at her. He felt the firm, undeniable kick of the child against his palm. He felt the heat of her skin, the steady, rhythmic beating of her heart. He looked at the blood on his hands, the blood of her abusers, the blood of his enemies, and for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like a stain. It felt like a shield. "I am broken, Elsie," he wept, a single tear slipping free to track through the soot on his cheek. "I am a ruined thing. Then we are both ruined." Elsie smiled, leaning up to press her forehead against his chest. "And we will just have to build something beautiful out of the pieces." Silas broke. The heavy iron walls he had built around his heart for a decade collapsed into dust. He dropped to his knees in front of her, wrapping his massive arms around her waist, burying his face against her belly. He held her with a desperate, holy reverence, his broad shoulders shaking as he finally laid the hangman to rest in the blood-soaked dirt of the cabin, choosing, at last, to live. EP aujourd'hui, 6 months later. The Devil's Throat was no longer a moor of ice and death. The summer sun, brilliant and golden, poured into the canyon, painting the granite walls in warm hues of amber and rose. The alpine meadow just beyond the cave mouth had erupted in a riot of color: bluebells, fireweed, and Indian paintbrush swaying gently in the warm breeze. The cabin had changed. The bullet holes in the heavy timber door had been patched. The bloody earth of the root cellar had been cleaned, the trapdoor sealed tight and covered with a thick, woven rug. Fresh venison cured in the smokehouse, and a small garden of hardy root vegetables clung to the rocky soil near the creek. On the porch, a wide swing bench suspended by heavy iron chains creaked rhythmically. Elsie sat on the bench. She wore a dress of soft, light blue cotton, her hair loose and shining in the sun. The jagged scar on her forearm was a pale silver line, a testament to a war won and a life claimed. She was not alone. Silas Vance sat beside her. The wolf pelt coat was gone, replaced by a clean canvas shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose his thick, scarred forearms. The cold, dead slate of his eyes had been permanently replaced by a warm, watchful peace. At his feet, sitting on the sun-warmed porch boards, was a cradle. It was not a rough, hastily built thing. It was a masterpiece of mounting craftsmanship, carved from polished cherry wood, the rockers sanded so smooth they moved with the whisper of a breath. From inside the cradle, a sound drifted up into the quiet canyon air. A coo. A bright, happy gurgle. Silas leaned forward. He reached down with a hand that had once been known only for dealing death. He extended a single, thick finger. A tiny, perfect hand reached up from the blankets and wrapped tightly around his knuckle. Silas smiled. It was a genuine, full expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes and softened the harsh lines of his face. He looked at Elsie, his heart so full it felt as though it might burst against his ribs. "He has a strong grip," Silas murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble of pure pride. "He'll be holding a hammer before he can walk." Elsie laughed, a bright, musical sound that chased the last remaining shadows from the canyon. She leaned her head against Silas's massive shoulder, closing her eyes as the mountain breeze brushed across her face. "He is a Vance," she said simply, her hand coming to rest over Silas's heart. "He is exactly what he is meant to be." Silas kissed the top of her head, his arm wrapping securely around her waist. He looked out at the canyon, at the jagged peaks that shielded them from a world of cruel men and hollow piety. He had come to the devil's throat to die, a ghost haunting his own life. But as the baby laughed and his wife held him close, Silas knew the truth. The hangman was dead, but the father had just begun to live.